Welcome to this Harvard Data Science Initiative special event. Jill Lepore in conversation with Fran Berman. I'm David Parks, and along with my colleague Francesca Dominici, I serve as faculty co-director of the Harvard Data Science Initiative. Done well, data science is a power for good in understanding the world around us in new ways. We grapple with inevitably complex, diverse, and just ill-formed data to make progress on critical problems, from pandemics to poverty to pollution. At the same time, we know that data science done badly can be deeply problematic and serve to continue and even amplify inequity and even cause new harms. As leaders of a cross-university initiative, we can learn from our colleagues like Fran and Jill, who examine the societal impact of technology and look at data, information, truth, and trust through the lens of history. Indeed, throughout Jill's career, she has explored, and allow me to read from her website for a moment, absences and asymmetries in the historical record, with a particular emphasis on the history and technology of evidence. Her scholarship has found a wide audience through her best-selling books, including 2019's These Truths, A History of the United States, and 2015's The Secret History of Wonder Woman, as well as through her writing for The New Yorker, where she is a staff writer. During today's talk, we look forward to hearing about her most recent book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future. Jill Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History and Affiliate Professor of Law at Harvard University. She's been a finalist for the National Book Award, the National Magazine Award, and twice for the Pulitzer Prize. And she's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society.
We are so delighted to welcome Fran and Jill here today. In just a moment, I will hand over to Fran to kick off what I know will be a fascinating conversation. Before that, allow me to tell you a little bit about her. Fran Berman is a data scientist whose current work focuses on the social and environmental impact of the Internet of Things. Her commitments to questions at the intersection of technology and the public interest has profound implications for our understanding of our technology impacts humanity and advances our understanding of how we can harness technological advances for good. Fran Berman is the Edward Hamilton Distinguished Professor of Computer Science at Rensselaer Polytechnical Institute. Earlier, she served as a director of the San Diego Supercomputer Centers from 2001 to 2009. At Harvard, she is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and was in 2019-2020 the Catherine Amsel Bessel Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. I cannot forget to mention too that Fran served as one of the very first Harvard Data Science Initiative visiting fellows. She's a fellow of the Association of Computing Machinery, the IEEE, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Alfred Sloan Foundation and the National Council on the Humanities. So Fran, thank you for being here today. It is my pleasure now to hand over to you to get started.
Thanks, Francesca. Jill, we need you too.
Hello.
Hi. All right. So thank you to Francesca, and thanks to the Harvard Data Science Initiative for making this possible. Jill and I are really looking forward to the next hour, so let's get started. The Simulmatics Corporation, born in 1959 and dead by 1970, was a window to today. Today, a tech-powered world in which data is everywhere and drives everything. Jill's book, If Then, How the Simulmatics Corporation Invented the Future, describes the extraordinary history of the company, one of the first companies to automate, simulate, and predict human behavior for commercial purposes. The book explores the company's successes and ultimate failure in the 1960s and its lessons for today. History and tech, tech and culture, there's a lot to explore here. Jill and I were fellows last year at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She was finishing the book and working on some projects, and I was working on the social environmental impacts of the Internet of Things. It was a match made in heaven and at Radcliffe. And it's wonderful to continue our wonderful conversations from last year today, courtesy of the Data Science Initiative. So I know many of you have not gone out, bought the book, and read the book at this moment. So I thought I would start out by asking Jill to talk a little bit about the book and how she came to write it.
Yeah, sure, thanks. And first, I too want to thank the Harvard Data Science Initiative for the invitation to this event and everyone who's come out, you know, on a Friday afternoon for this conversation, but especially Fran. It's such an honor and a real treat to be in conversation with you. It is, you know, one of the remarkable things about a place like Radcliffe. This is exactly the kind of conversation such an institute is hoping to cultivate. And I'm really grateful. And I think the book also benefits from the conversations that you and I had over lunches before everybody had to go scatter and go home last year. So it's a treat. Thank you for doing this. Yeah, so the book tells the story of the Simulmatics Corporation. I came across the story in 2015. I was looking for, I just needed like a paragraph for an essay I was writing on the history of the polling industry, because it had become clear to me that polling was being replaced by data analytics, you know, political prediction companies, and I just kind of needed to know, when did that happen? And I read something about the Simulmatics Corporation and its role in the 1960 election, working for the Kennedy campaign. And historians, you know, you all hunt for data in all kinds of ways, but we look for evidence in the archives. And I kept trying to find the archives of this company. You know, it was kind of a major corporate, I mean, small, but significant, had a significant history and quite self-conscious about its own significance. I couldn't find the papers anywhere. Like, the corporation disappeared, its archives vanished. But I did find that the head of the research board, who was a political scientist at MIT, his papers existed at MIT, and so I went diving through those. And then I found that not only had Simulmatics pioneered the work of election simulation in 1960, but then they'd gone on to undertake a series of projects, most of which at some level failed, but which all shared the same ambition, which was that you could use computer technology to predict human behavior. And then you could sell that as a product to other entities. You know, they formed a corporation, went public in 1961, raised a fair amount of money, and had some really interesting clients over the course of the 1960s. And to me, it was a puzzling and confusing story, but it filled in a big void. Like, I kind of didn't understand how we got from Cold War behavioral science to Facebook and social media. And it was kind of like a missing link.
I'm unmuting myself. The wonders of Zoom. Yeah, so I found that really fascinating about the book. And truth be told, I didn't know anything about the corporation before I read the book. So it was fascinating to me. And in many ways, Simulmatics was really a company ahead of this time. So as I read in your book, its mass cultural model predated Amazon. Its relationship and its partnership with the New York Times launched data journalism and data-driven election predictions. Its work to measure voter behavior in 1960s predated Cambridge Analytica's work to manipulate elections in 2016. Its work with the Defense Department to plan and conduct the Vietnam War promoted the notion of war simulation to meet and promote war reality. So, you know, all of this was really, from our perspective, way ahead of its time. Yet Simulmatics Technologies couldn't meet its ambition. Its leadership was myopic, its science was sloppy, it ultimately failed to deliver. So its problems were both kind of its time and of our time. And so as a historian, what do you see as the lessons learned from the Simulmatics experience? Do we have, you know, kind of greater or fewer rules at this point in time to rein in companies than we did then?
That's a really interesting question. I think we have fewer, and among the reasons that we have fewer has to do with the legacy of Simulmatics itself. I mean, I guess one of the things that was striking to me in looking at Simulmatics' work, understanding that they weren't really very good at doing this, but they were quite brilliant, and they were extremely well-intentioned. These are not nefarious people. They weren't, trying to destroy institutions. They were just trying to figure out how to use these new tools. They did absolutely want to make money, but they actually wanted to preserve American institutions in many ways. What was interesting to me was how much pushback there was at the time. After Kennedy won in 1960, the Simulmatics Corporation claimed credit for his victory. They said that he had, everything that they had advised him to do, he did, and then he won, and therefore he won because of their advice. Now, you can't prove that, and he was pretty pissed about it. So it's his entire campaign and the incoming administration. That's kind of, that's just the vanity of a political candidate. But what was striking to me was how uniformly American newspaper editorials condemned Kennedy for having used this tool. Partly because, in another kind of resonance with our day, there was tremendous anxiety about the future of work in the late 1950s, early 1960s because of automation. And Kennedy, of course, the Democrats or the Party of Labor had campaigned. He had made automation a plank in his platform. And he, was promising all these jobs retraining programs and job subsidies for people who are displaced by automation. And so not only was there kind of a general fear of computers are controlling our minds, which was just a cultural anxiety in the 1950s and early 1960s, but there was a specific fear of this guy who has run against automation was being controlled by a giant robot. No one really understands what a computer simulation of an election would be, so newspapers generally refer to it as a robot or a giant electronic brain. Or so I was fascinated to see how clear-cut it was to people at the time that this was unethical. There had been, some consideration of whether or not it was in fact illegal. And we don't have that debate anymore. I think if you're running for, town school committee, you might hire a prediction company to help you figure out your campaign strategy. We accept that proposition now. We might be anxious about the idea that you would hire such a company to provide you with advice to shape your campaign, we no longer question.
Why were they, so maybe it's the workforce issue that's helpful there, because, why would they be any more annoyed that he got the prediction from behavioral scientists and a machine than if he had a really, really, really good ad agency, right, that gave them the same exact advice?
Sure, but remember, the first kind of big ad agency-driven presidential campaign was very recently in the past. It was 1952, okay, when the Eisenhower campaign hired Rosser Reeves to write television spots for Eisenhower, who was the first presidential candidate to ever appear on television. That was extraordinarily controversial. His rival, Adlai Stevenson, the Democrat, his campaign dubbed Eisenhower's campaign the Cornflakes campaign, and they went to the FCC and said, this has got to be illegal. You cannot have a presidential candidate hiring an ad campaign to write, TV spots that are like those for toothpaste and laundry detergent. Like, that's just got to be illegal. That's got to be a violation of either the FCC or the FEC. In some way, this can't be allowed. And they didn't get anywhere with that. But in fact, Stevenson campaigned in 1952 against the Cornflakes campaign. He said, this is what's the problem with American politics, is this kind of crap. Like, this will destroy the country. So, 1960 is only 8 years later. There's been a kind of tacit acceptance of using advertising campaigns, and of course also the advice of pollsters, which presidents have been using since the 1930s. But there's a lot of anxiety about it. There really is just a tremendous cultural anxiety about computers. If anybody has seen the 1957 film Desk Set with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy plays an MIT systems engineer, and Katharine Hepburn runs a fact-checking department. And Spencer Tracy is going to be installing this giant, supposed to be like a UNIVAC, it's called MRAC, giant room-sized computer in her department. And the whole thing, you know, it's a screwball comedy romance between the two of them. But the whole movie is about the anxiety of the displacement of people by machines. It's just to give you just, you know, to remind people watching how prevalent that anxiety was. So if voters were going to be replaced by, like, if you kind of walk that to its logical conclusion, like if Kennedy could hire a company that could simulate the election and predict the outcome, then tailor his message in order to achieve the desired outcome, at some point, why even bother with voting? Like, that's the anxiety, that you could displace the voters themselves, right? And I think we actually fairly need to still be asking that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, we still have exactly the same anxiety this time.
Right. If voters are just tools of, we're just pulling the lever, but we're being marched around to do the bidding of an algorithm. That, you know, I think to many people, that's how things feel.
We definitely want to get, we definitely want to get to that. So one of the things I want to ask you is, in honor of my friends and colleagues at Berkman Klein Center and all the other techies out there, is really kind of what kind of tech did they actually do? And so the popular press called the data and the software and the hardware Simulmatics uses the people machine, right? So you just like wrap it all up. That's the people machine. You write in the book, and I'm going to quote from the book so people will know when they get their book where this quote came from. The machine, crammed with microscopic data about voters and issues, could act as a macroscope. You could ask it any question about the kind of move a candidate might make, and it would be able to tell you how voters down to the tiniest segment of the electorate would respond. So let's talk about how this actually worked for them, right? And so, you know, as we know, they had a computer, and that computer had models. And those models, you know, how do we characterize them in today's terms? Would they data-driven simulations? You know, where did they get the models from? Was it machine learning? Was it anything that would resemble today's AI? How did they vet the models? You know, where did that stuff come from?
Yeah. This is a really, really, really interesting question. And I spent some time with this because the calling what they did the people machine was the work of their PR guy, the director of public relations for the company, who in fact wrote an essay for Harper's Magazine about the company without revealing that he was the PR guy for the company. So a lot of, you know, there's just a lot of boosterism and flim flam. Like, it's not a people, what the hell? It's not even a machine. Like, what? It's just, yeah, it's just boosterism. So it's hard to cut back from that. And to be fair to the scientists who worked on the project, a lot of them were deeply troubled by the way the work was characterized by their PR. So Robert Abelson, a quite distinguished Yale scholar who had been one of the founders of the company and had done some of the initial work, after I think Ed Greenfield, who was the president of the company, who had come from his own ad agency to found Simulmatics, he was on CBS radio. I was never able to find the tape, like, you know, radio stuff just vanishes. But apparently he, you know, he just kind of promised the moon on CBS radio, like took credit for everything about the Kennedy campaign and said, you know, our people machine can simulate anything. And Abelson wrote basically a letter of resignation in and said, like, if you do that again, I'm out. Like, I can't be answerable to this nonsense. Like, we did not do this, we did not do that, and we can't do this and we can't do that. Like, we ran this one program, man. Calm down. So, you know, but they're trying to sell a product. So what did they do? They never owned their own computers, which is sometimes hard for people to believe, right? But the computer, there just were not even a lot of computers around. It's 1959. There was at that point, there was one computer at MIT for all of, I think it was a 704, an IBM 704 for all of the New England schools who were in a consortium to use it. You could never get time on it. You know, they didn't have time sharing yet. It's before time sharing. So you had to get a slot to do anything. So they're like, we can't get time on the MIT machine. I think they almost entirely exclusively used IBM machines that were at the IBM Service Center in New York. IBM's world headquarters was in downtown New York, but they also had a service center where you could rent time. And I think it probably was a 704. So they're doing most of what they're doing is collecting and preparing data. They don't have a lot of time to run stuff on the machine. And that's part of why everything's kind of so sketchy, right? The scarcity is really interesting for us to ponder. I tried at some point in the book, and I worked really hard to find a fact that could communicate to the reader the speed of an IBM 704 as against like an iPhone 6. And in kind of floating point, it's laughable. Well, I mean, I could have done their entire project while I spoke this sentence, and it took them years. Anyway, but what they did, so that it was the original project was extremely interesting and very academically inclined. So if you think about it in this way, after the Second World War, social scientists who were interested in quantification wanted to figure out how to do predictive work, because that's what the government wanted. They wanted predictive social science in order to wage a war of ideas against communism. They needed to think about how ideas get into people's head and how to change their minds. That was what the Cold War was about, right? Don't believe in communism, come with us. Defect, be a capitalist, right? So it's all about how to figure out messages and how to send them to people. But the Ford Foundation, funders of behavioral science, wanted to be able to predict how messages would affect people. Well, what's the best single way to begin a study of that project? It's voting, because voting generates its own data, right? You have election returns every 2 years, and then you could match that up with census data. And then we also have pretty extensive public opinion data, right? Which is thought to be it's much more reliable then than it is now, because the response rate so high in the 1950s compared to now. So most of the problems with polling that we think about now didn't exist in the same way then. So these guys figured out, all right, here's a way to test whether we can make a predictive model of human behavior. We will predict how people will vote based on how they voted in the past and what public opinion polls tell us about them. But you don't have information down to the named individual level, right? You have aggregate data about a county, or people who are registered as Republicans in a particular precinct, say.
Yeah.
So what they wanted to have what they called massive data. They didn't call it big data. It was massive. And their original project was, I've seen referred to, and this seems to have fact checked, is the biggest social science research project up to that point. What they did, which was very clever, they wrote to Gallup and to Roper, which is the Elmo Roper, the other big polling agency. And they said, can we have all your old punch cards? If you haven't thrown them away, can we have your old punch cards from all of your previous surveys? And so Gallup and Roper say, okay, I mean, we're just going to trash them. And so they get all these punch cards from public opinion surveys, beginning in 52, and then they have all the election returns, and then they have census data. And so they compile it all, and they aggregate it in such a way that it can, stuff that, so if you asked in one question, like, do you support Eisenhower urging us to be more involved in Korea? And another poll said, do you think Eisenhower should take a stronger stand against communism? They would somehow make those to be like one poll, about a stronger stand about communism, because the different pollsters asked somewhat different questions. So they had to try to, I don't work like normalize, is that what you would say, the data? Yeah. So they reduced it to, they took all the voters and came up with 480 possible voter types, like New England Catholic white woman who voted for Kennedy would be a type.
Okay.
And then they took all the issues on which people had been questioned and reduced them to, I think it's like 62 issue clusters. And then from this, they constructed an imaginary population of 3,000 possible individuals, and on which they could test, if you emphasized one issue, how they would change their opinions about other issues.
So your mileage kind of varied about the
your mileage varied. Yeah. There is actually a kind of hilarious, if anyone has ever seen 1947 film called Magic Town, starring Jimmy Stewart, in which Jimmy Stewart plays a pollster who's not making any money until he comes across this town of 3,000 people that happens to be a perfectly mathematically accurate representation of the entire American electorate. So he just moves there, and instead of doing polls, he just walks around town and asks people about issues. And then he reports that in his weekly column, and he's always right, because he's found that magical 3,000 people. That's what Simulmatics was trying to do, but mathematically.
I think you might have to give us a movie list to go with this book. I don't know. All right, I'm going to get to something that I know the data science people will love, and it's something you and I talked a lot about. So I'm going to do a big reading from your book because you don't have a lot of good things to say about data scientists and data science. And that's clear in the book. And in a great article, by the way, you just published in Nature, where another one of our Radcliffe fellows, the amazing Joe Baker, is the senior editor. So shout out for Joe. But your summary is really thoughtful and it's worth for us discussing. So here's what you say in the book. In the 2020s, a flood of money into universities attempted to make the study of data a science, with data science initiatives, data science programs, data science degrees, data science centers. Much academic research that fell under the label data science produced excellent and invaluable work across many fields of inquiry, findings that would not have been possible without computational discovery. And no field should be judged by its worst practitioners. Still, the shadiest data science, like shadiest behavioral science, grew in influence by way of self-mystification, exaggerated claims, and all-around chicanery, including fast-changing, razzle-dazzle buzzwords from big data to data analytics. Calling something AI, data science, and predictive became a way to raise huge amounts of venture capital funding, and a credulous press aided in hyping those claims, and a broken federal government failed to exercise even the least oversight. So I remember a number of our discussions about these kinds of issues. Always fun over great Vietnamese food. And not surprisingly, my own view is a little more charitable about this. Because in my view, data science, behavioral science, and other emerging fields sort of thrive in the academic sector, in the wild, if you will, and where exploration is primary. But when they're used in the private sector, they're often weaponized, and they're weaponized from the point of view of exploitation. And so, you know, in some sense, isn't the kind of hyperbole that, and other ills you mentioned, and I agree with many of them, more of a characteristic of data science for hire than data science in the wild? Isn't data science really a victim of this kind of process rather than the perpetrator?
Yeah, you know, I think that's probably fairly stated. And, you know, I'm not standing here waiting for people to throw stones at me. Like I treasure my colleagues at the university and the college who do this work. And you know, I'm not picking a fight. It tends to be the case across realms of knowledge that when a flood of money comes into a field, you know, it can often attract a lot of scallywags, you know, who just want the money. And I also think sometimes some of that money is coming from the data for hire companies that want to launder their money. Do you know what I mean? They want to borrow the prestige of a university that really is interested in the pursuit of truth and, you know, making interesting discoveries for the sake of knowledge. They want to they want to affiliate themselves with the university because what they're doing is they feel so dirty. And I think that's ethically concerning. And I you know, there was a lot of that going on in the 1960s with behavioral science in the Vietnam War and with chemical weapons, right? So all the student protests and anti-war movement that happened, you know, at MIT and also at Harvard and many other places, including Stanford, you know, were students saying, well, we thought our professors were, you know, studying chemistry, you know, they're out there, you know, working on napalm. Like what, that can't be okay. Like that can't be okay. They're making, you know, there are also many people like Simulmatics, which was a private corporation that all these guys own stock in. You know, we would think about that as a conflict of interest, maybe outside of a business school, which has a very different set of standards around that stuff. So I worry about the lessons of the Vietnam War having been forgotten. That is to say, the relationship between higher education and defense work or contract work for pharmaceutical companies, say, or fossil fuel companies. I think higher education is really deeply implicated, especially with fossil fuels. I mean, so this is not some critique that of mine, you know, that is some kooky Luddite critique of this specific thing, so much as it is a real concern about higher education and the effects of money on higher education. I also think, you know, you can persuade me that I'm wrong about this, and because I don't have enough evidence to bring to bear. But sometimes when I read descriptions of what not here, but at some institutions, what data science is, it really sounds like market research. And I think if you want to have an undergraduate major in market research, you should have an undergraduate major in market research and not call it data science. I think there's a really weird slippage. Like, it's a term that doesn't really, like, we could have a department of the study of facts would say as much as what a department of data, the science of data. Like, I have some objections to the term to begin with.
Yeah.
So, what I tried to do in the passage, in and around the passage you've read from is, think about what are all the incredibly meaningful kinds of insights that we can gain about the natural world, say, that are unavailable to us without, kind of machine learning driven, computational, processing of data. Like, that stuff is incredible. It's like a very, very, very long list. My story that I'm telling is largely about all the pretty damaging stuff, the unintended consequences of stuff that is well-intentioned, that people are doing to make money. Simulmatics, everything they did, it's a for-profit company. They were behavioral scientists for hire.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack. We could probably go on another 4 hours about this because it's really interesting stuff, and I share the same concerns that you have, but from a really different point of view. Because I think, first of all, you have to remember that data science is an actual academic discipline. I mean, it's always been, at least since there was data and since people use data as a tool to get to their scientific questions or their social questions or whatever. But as a field, it's really kind of nascent. And so you do see a lot of experiments out there. How do we teach data science? Is it in different departments? Is it in statistics? Is it in computer science? Is it a multidisciplinary program? What's in the curriculum? Is it just machine learning and statistics? What about a class in ethics? What about a class in data preservation, and data stewardship? What about classes in databases? And, so those kinds of things. And so, it seems to me over the last, decade or two that the community has really been trying to figure out what is that kind of cohort of a discipline that wherever data science falls in your university, you're going to teach. And then there's the whole issue. So that's like what's in data science. And then there's the whole issue about how data science is now used in the private sector. And, it's everybody's like competitive advantage. If you're a company, it's hard not to use data science because then you're not competing with the rest. And then, of course, everybody, Harvard Business Review, I want to point this out, says it's the sexiest job of the 21st century. And, so there is a lot of hype around it. But, in some sense, data science has a real look at an invaluable, but not the only tool in order to explore questions on your mind, scientific questions or whatever. It's very valuable, but you have to think about it in context. So here's another question I had for you. Of you, maybe we actually share. I mean, today, and maybe I think with Simulmatics as well, in my opinion, there's somewhat of an overtrust in technology. We look at the data science results, we look at the tech results. We don't so worry about whether there are humans in the loop or whether we have contextualized it for the limitations of the machines and the limitation of the programs and the limitations of the models and the limitations on the training sets. If you think about medicine, we don't just rely on results of the machines. You always have doctors and medical professionals interpreting those results and putting them in context and trying to figure out all the things that were not captured by the disease model or the treatment model. So, in some sense, data should be placed in that same thing. And as a historian, new technology is always racing ahead of the curve, right? And then the kind of societal limitations and ways of sort of forcing it into the public interest catch up. We saw that in the Industrial Revolution. We see that all over history. So, what are the right ways of approaching that? What can we do today to really take this nascent Wild West of data and kind of, civilize it in some sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, one thing that I've tried to offer up as a historian into public discourse is a way of thinking about data as a kind of knowledge, not the best kind of knowledge. We have a whole cult of data now where, you know, whatever you do, if you say it's data driven somehow, you can get money for it, it can be supported. Like you can no longer question it if it's data driven, you know, like the evidence, it sort of replaces evidence-based, which, you know, which are just both bizarre formulations. Like what is that? Like I can say, you know, I chose my new puppy based on a data-driven preference I have, like, because I have thoughts about a puppy. Like what is, it's just meaningless crap. Like, and I'm exhausted by it. So a way that I've tried to, you know, analytically take some time to think through why do people who use the term in that way, why does that self-mystification work for them? Why isn't there enough questioning of that? And you know, I gave this talk a number of years ago called How Data Killed Facts, which was about the way that people trying to make a lot of money off of selling what they did with data as the best form of knowledge contributed to the denigration of how we know things in other fashions. So the larger, I'm not going to give a long lecture here, but like the larger analytical framework that I give historically is to think about the history of the elemental unit of knowledge, you know, kind of in over the last centuries, kind of maybe we could begin with the mystery, like the mystery of religion, right? The mystery of things that we cannot know. Sort of think of, you know, in the sense of the medieval Catholic Church, like mysteries are things that God knows and we cannot know. Like the mystery of conception, the mystery of resurrection, the mystery of the afterlife. They're things that are just mysteries in the world. And a lot of what the Reformation is about replacing the mystery with the fact. Like the fact is about, you know, it comes from the law, but comes from a commitment to the idea that humans can actually know things if we observe them and submit our observations to rules of evidence involve corroboration and fairness, the kinds of rules that then are put to a jury. The rise of the fact is really associated with the rise of the trial by jury. And then that diffuses into the whole culture, like the fact becomes central to the scientific revolution, right? That you could establish facts through empirical observation and corroboration, the corroboration of other science. Like we have this whole, you know, what historians call the cult of the fact. And it moves into journalism. By the time you get, you know, to Enlightenment and the years before the Industrial Revolution, you know, historians talk about the great age of quantification. The fact is really challenged by the number. That if you have people doing research across great distances, the best way for them to share their observations is by counting things, you know, and then we have the rise of statistics and people begin to count populations, and demography is born on that we can count votes and we can therefore consent to be governed. And, you know, the rise of the number is incredibly important in the US, especially through given the nature of the census and its centrality to our political order. And it's not really until the 20th century that something like data comes to be called data in our sense, which is a set of numbers that human beings can't calculate. You would need a machine to calculate for you. So you could even begin that, you know, with the 1890 census and the whole earth counting machines, like there are tabulating machines that are counting for the first time. But by the time you get to 1950 and the UNIVAC is running the census, that really is the beginning of the age of data. It also happens so that moment where we kind of turn from, you know, mysteries, facts, numbers to data in 1950 with the UNIVAC and the census, is a time when all of American culture has oriented itself around the idea that scientists are godlike, right? In 1960, Time Magazine's Man of the Year is Men of Science. Like just like all men of science are somehow gods. There's this incredible elevation of like, data is evidence that you can't understand, only machines or men of science can understand. It's an incredible, like it's a weird moment in terms of challenges to the authority of white men to say, oh, our machines can understand you. Like there's a whole weird sexual and racial politics to that elevation. And then the desire, especially of these early, you know, the guys who start artificial intelligence in 1956, the self-mystification and self-importance of it all. I would say as a historian, having encountered, you know, many people in the archives that I get to know extremely well and get a vibe from them. Oh, these guys really liked being worshipped, you know, and they love the idea that the rise of the age of data is in a way a return to the age of mystery. They are the priests, they are the gods only, you know, the machines are the gods and the computer scientists are the priests, and the rest of us, you know, we just have to look up and hope that they get it right.
You know, while you're talking, I see the number of the questions going up.
Hopefully this isn't a bunch of people gonna just
We can
draw
spend-
their bowstrings at me.
we can spend another hour on the demographics of what happened. I'm going to ask you one last question because this blows my mind, and then I'm going to ask Liz to give us some of these wonderful questions. So this really did blows my mind because in an unanticipated way, the founders of Simulmatics really did predict the future. So you write that Ithiel de Solapool, co-founder of Simulmatics, wrote an essay towards the year 2018, 50 years before, in 1968, right? And he said, let's see, I'm going to quote it. He predicted that by 2018, it will be cheaper to store information in a computer bank than on paper. Tax returns, social security records, census forms, military records, perhaps criminal records, security files, school transcripts, bank statements, credit ratings, job records would in 2018 be stored on computers that could communicate with one another over a vast international network. People living in 2018 would be able to find out anything about anyone without ever leaving their desks. We will have the technological capability to do this, where we have the legal right. And so I think Pool's question, as you have written, is relevant today. And the question, I think, for all of us is, what are the legal, moral, societal constraints that we need to create to make sure that technology is a tool for the public good, rather than the public being a tool for the advancement of technology? Does anything give you hope today about any of this?
I mean, I think, you know, Poole was just brilliant. Like, I was brilliant. And he foresaw that. And then, but actually the takeaway of the essay is, you know, we'll have to see what they do in 2018. Like, it just kicks the can down the road. And, you know, the lesson of the 1960s, and in particular of Vietnam, but certainly of this behavioral science research, is no, you don't kick the can down the road. You don't just invent Facebook and see if it destroys democracy. Like, I just think that if you worship people as disruptive innovators for long enough and just throw money at them and treat them like little boys, you know, they could really screw things up. Like, there's a set of ethical guidelines around research in almost any other area, right? The comeuppance that biologists had, you know, after Nuremberg, you know, and the medical research done by Nazis, the incredible shuddering of physicists after the Manhattan Project and the bombing of Hiroshima. You know, we have seen so many different kinds of scientists, you know, Union of Concerned Scientists types, like people who say, okay, clearly we shouldn't have done this. Let's come up with some rules for how we proceed from here. I had the expectation, as I think many people did, that 2016 would be that moment for people who deal with personal data. And it wasn't. It hasn't been. It's worse now than it was then. No, we can say that's the federal government's problem, and it is the federal government's problem, but it is also everyone's problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, everything Cambridge Analytica did can be used by can be done by other people. I mean, they didn't own that particular kind of approach. So yeah, it is worse. Okay, so there are a bunch of questions here. And apologies to people who don't get their questions read because there's too many to read all of them. So here's one. What lessons can organizers of political and social movements learn from the mistakes of Simulmatics and be aware of when trying to mobilize people? What's the difference between leadership and manipulation?
I think there's you know, one of the long-term legacies, you know, I wouldn't put this by any means all on the shoulders of Simulmatics, which is, again, a small failed company, but of the turn toward doing micro-targeted political messaging, which starts in the 1950s and then, you know, only increases, is that its critics said the lesson to be learned was, this will destroy the sense of a common good. If you only ever talk to voters as if the way you expect them to vote is based on who they are and what would be good for them, you have destroyed the fabric of our political institutions and our constitutional system, which requires voters to think about what would be good for everybody. Like we are actually not like republicanism with a lowercase r means that we are supposed to go to our polling place or fill out our form and put it in the mail with an eye toward, you know, as a virtuous citizen in a classic sense of what virtue is, what is, who is going to best represent the interests of all of the people, not who's going to lower my tax rate or do this or that for me. Our entire political discourse has changed around this kind of messaging, the micro-targeting that divides voters' interests against other voters' interests, and even makes political coalitions within a single political party hard to hold on to, because we kind of have all swallowed you know, there are 480 voter types or there are 10,000 voter types, whatever number it is. You are not just a citizen. You know, you are not a citizen who's asked to think more broadly about what is good for all of us. So if I were running a political campaign, you know, it'd be hard to not use these tools, but I think rhetorically, it's important to talk about all of us. It's important, you know, there's so many problems with our institutions and the way that our primaries are working and 1,000 other things. But that, the loftiness of American political rhetoric is at the moment certainly gone. You don't see it in a lot of places at all. But it's even gone in in a small local election. You don't see that anymore. People are just kind of talking and they're sending out one by one texts, you know, that are designed to tell you what to do, not to ask you how to help.
I mean, and in a way, I think that all of this customization that the data allows us is really a double-edged sword, because, you know, if I want to be in a cohort of people who have a particularly light, seaworthy kayak, I can do that. I can also, you know, hear news that is particularly tailored to my beliefs. And so, you know, in the first case, that customization is great. In the second space, you know, that means that everybody who believes something slightly different hear different news or a different spin on the news. So how we're supposed to come together as a country.
Yeah, and I would just point out again, Poole foresaw that in another essay he wrote also in 1968 in a special issue of a magazine with JCR Licklider, said, you know, here's among the things I would predict will be the personal newspaper, you know, and it'll be a problem because we won't be able to have people belong to interest groups any longer because they'll just have their personal interests. Yeah, and, you know, then you have a highly atomized, profoundly alienated polity.
Yeah, you have your Spotify for news. So this next question is one that I was going to ask, so thank you very much, listener. Let's stipulate that we're able to predict human behavior in some number of years, whether 5, 10, or 50. What are the lessons from history? What should we be doing about this now? You know, what can go well, what can go badly?
So I'm sorry, I don't mean to be ornery, but I won't stipulate that. Like, I don't think there are laws of human behavior the way there are laws of gravity. I think the fundamental premise of a lot of the behavioral science is really interesting. We should study human behavior. Like, I don't mean, you know, and there are reasons to do, obviously, quantitative work in that realm. I actually think that literature is more meaningful and poetry is more meaningful as a way to study human behavior. This is why I'm a humanist. So I'm kind of a hard sell on the idea that it's somehow better. I think it's really important and really interesting. And I, of course, you know, study it as well. And, you know, the harder of the social sciences. But I think it's a fallacy that there are laws of human behavior. There's, and critics of Simulmatics point this out again and again and again, like, the hubris of that presumption. And we, you know, for instance, history is not a predictive social science. And although you will find historians who will claim, they're futurists, right? Who claim that history is a predictive social science, because you can make a lot of money appearing on television and selling books if you say that history is predictive. It's all lies. Like, it's not like, it's not, I mean, it's hooey. And I have yet to be persuaded. There are lessons to be drawn from the study of history, but they're not predictions. And I think, you know, there's a wonderful book by Jenny Anderson that I reference in in that Nature piece, I think it's called The Invention of the Future, about how the fetish for prediction became the central feature of academic life in the 1950s, because the Ford Foundation was funding most university research. And what the Ford Foundation wanted were predictions. They wanted to turn the social sciences into hard sciences. And so they just kept saying, come up with a predictive model, come up with a predictive model, be better than economists. You can see if you look at faculty salaries in universities, the natural sciences are predictive, and sometimes some of the better paid parts of the university. The social sciences that are predictive are the next best paid. Then you get to the social sciences that, you know, refuse to, you know, sell themselves as predictive. And then you get to the humanities. Like there's money here that I think is about what knowledge we think. I do not mean, it's not zero sum. I do not mean to diminish work in other fields, but I think if you want to understand the human condition, you know, listening to an opera is as meaningful as having a data-driven study of whatever it is that you think is going to predict the timing of the next insurrection in country X.
That's also, you know, I mean, that's also the way we use our economics to sort of value things. You know, why are baseball players paid more than swimming instructors? Right? Arguably, swimming instructors, you know, do more for the public interest than baseball players, at least in terms of saving your life. So, so in some sense, it's that kind of economics of the market, which are you know, usually patently unfair, don't you think? You know,
yeah. I mean, I'm not going to defend some like massive critique of these salaries. I'm just saying, like, it's not idle to say we value some kinds of knowledge more than others. Like, there is some evidence that we, in fact, you know, in a specific monetary sense, value them.
Yeah, from looking at you, I can tell you for sure that you do not work less hard than data scientists. So, okay, we had a fun question here, and I'm looking at it. Oh, now I've lost it. Oh, okay. So it's January 23rd, Jill, of next year, and the president calls you from the Oval Office, and I guess you can decide like your response based on which president you think will be there, and asks you to design future regulations in education. So where would you start? What would you tell this president?
So it's really chiefly not the purview of the federal government to regulate education in any way or at any level. You know, Trump gave a talk yesterday calling for a complete reform of history, American history education in schools and colleges, that we should, you know, we should reframe history education as patriotic education. This is all malarkey. It's person's not been in a K through 12 classroom in maybe his lifetime, except when he was a child. I don't really have an educational agenda. I think that there are some changes, you know, we've talked about, and you've been really involved in thinking about data science initiatives at colleges and universities. I think it's I think, you know, I was at Berkeley right before the world ended in February. And their data science program has a required history course that I think is really interesting. Like, I actually do think that we are, you know, our students increasingly need to study data science for all kinds of reasons. They need to be equipped with this, you know, as a rigorous method and discipline. But I do think some of the programs that I've looked into, and we've talked about this, have a kind of like stapled on like ethics like unit, or like just kind of tacked on history week that's taught by, you know, a computer scientist and not a historian. I do think given the magnitude of this turning in higher education, that it would do well to be better integrated with other parts of the university, and also that academics who are humanists, say, and then in the softer social sciences would do well. This is why I'm here having this conversation with you. Like, I think we need to be talking across these differences and finding the best in one another's approaches. So I wouldn't be serving in a presidential administration in any case, but if I were in a position in a university administration or, you know, on a local school committee, I would want to think about how to not sort different realms of knowledge into different bins and say, this one's important. I mean, I would say, like, watching my kids go through K-12 public school, every day it's STEM matters and everything else is just, window dressing. STEM matters and everything else is just window dressing. I think that's left us with a tremendously ill-informed public. With catastrophic lack of civics education, with catastrophic lack of knowledge of foreign languages. Like, I have a lot of opinions about education, but I guess this is a long-winded way of saying I shouldn't be in that position.
Okay, well, I'm gonna actually ask you one of my questions for the last question, and I'll just blow the horn of an area that I'm really interested in, which is as cyberspace, as technology becomes critical infrastructure, if it is unregulated, it's hard to make it non-exploitative. For all of us, we're in school online, we're ordering groceries online, we're doing as much as we're having this online. There it is out there. And of course, each one of us that logged in, our data is, carefully categorized by the services. They may be limited by Harvard or they may not. And so we're basically now living in the Wild West where we can be exploited anytime, anywhere by anybody. And for me, once this stuff becomes non-optional, once it becomes critical infrastructure, we must regulate it. I know we don't have a lot of confidence in people to do that in a good way. I know it takes practice. GDPR in Europe is a really good example of that. But, how do we get from here to a place where technology really is working for us? And, rather than us working for technology, what do you think should happen with the federal government, with societal norms and practices, and with the other, tools and levers that we have to really improve things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the members of your audience probably have more clearer ideas about what the best steps are to proceed there. One thing that I fear is that the very wealthy will opt out of all these technologies. Like, they actually they won't need them. And when they become critical infrastructure, is this distinction that you would like to make, that they will then, it'll be the poor that are fully monitored, that can only engage in transactions in this form. And the wealthy will have ways of avoiding those things. So I think that change needs to happen pretty soon before those people find a way to opt out. And have even less incentive to turn their resources toward supporting the kind of really very radical reforms that are required. I mean, I think my position on most of this stuff pretty closely tracks, say, the kind of more hard-nosed Elizabeth Warren position on regulation. I hope she becomes a member of the cabinet, and I hope she's given an incredible amount of enforcement power.
I did get one last question, which is, what are you working on next? Do you have any more technology books in the or articles?
No. I totally just fell into it. I mean, I teach the history of technology. Like, it's a thing that I do, but no, I am working on getting through the Zoom semester and trying to be there for my terrific students. I think this is a really, if we already didn't understand how diminished we are by our reliance on certain kinds of technology, and how helped we are by other kinds, I hope this is a clarifying time. So I'm, trying to just do the teaching and learn the lessons that can be learned from it.
Well, I'm going to hand it back to David, but before I do, I just want to say that thanks so much for writing.
Thank you, Fran.
Doing this, and it's been a blast, and I wish you all the best. I hope it is amazingly successful.
Thanks, you too. Thanks so much for doing this, Fran.
Well, it's my great honor just to close this out. Thank you, Jill Lepore. Thank you, Fran Berman. You've both been wonderful. We've learned a lot. You've given us a lot to think about our future. We're very, very grateful for your time. For those of you out there in Zoom land, we're so glad that more than 200 of you were able to be with us here today. And just as a note, this talk will be featured as an article in an upcoming issue of the Harvard Data Science Review. And we hope that you'll check out that publication as well. For now, thanks to everybody.